Christian name is George Leonard Johnson, but courtesy of the Air Force, 22 years in the Air Force, because my surname is Johnson, I became Johnny. I got so used to it, and I preferred it to my Christian names, so now I'm known generally by all and sundry as Johnny Johnson. I first heard about the 617 Squadron in March 1943. At that stage, I was the bomb aimer on Flight Lieutenant McCarthy's crew. Eddie Joe was an American in the Canadian Air Force, and we were just coming close to the end of our first tour of 30 operations, at the end of which we were expecting a week's leave and then posting to a ground job of some description or to a non-flying air job, an operational air job. Wing Commander Gibson phoned Joe one day and asked him would he join this new special squadron which he was forming for one special trip. And Joe said, I'll have to ask the crew, which he did, and we said yes, we would go with him. And so we now were waiting, A, to finish our tour, and B, to go over to 617, or what was known then as Squadron X. It hadn't got its number by that time, it was known as Squadron X. And still hoping for our week's leave, because in anticipation of that, my fiancée and I had arranged to get married on the 3rd of April. The first thing we heard when we got to Scampton was no leave, which made me feel rather more than a little upset. Where goes my wedding? But Joe took us up to Gibson's office as a crew and said in his inimitable American style, we've just finished our first tour. We're entitled to a week's leave. My bomb aimer is supposed to be getting married on the 3rd of April, and he's going to get married on the 3rd of April. I was a little bit shocked that a flight lieutenant would sort of use that sort of extravagant language with the wing commander, but we got our leave and I got my wedding. And that again was typical of Joe's concern for his crew as a whole and not just for the flying side of it. What I say about Wing Commander Gibson, I feel has to be retrospective. Talk starting from the time on the squadron. At that time, I'm sure one of his greatest shortcomings was that he couldn't bring himself down to the lower levels in the service. He could mix admirably with senior officers, certainly, but with those above him, and with the officers under his command, down to perhaps Flight Lieutenant. But he was very impartial to junior officers and seemed to have little or no interest in the NCO aircrew. He was arrogant, he was bombastic, and he was a strict disciplinarian. But I'd have to say that at that time he was one of, if not the most experienced bomber pilots in the command, and had equally flown a tour of night fighters. I think he had something to be arrogant about. But I think his true indication as a leader was exhibited when he formed the new squadron. Obviously, in the first place, he felt he had to get more out of these people than he did out of a normal squadron, so he calmed down. He got whatever he wanted for the squadron. sometimes with great difficulty. In fact, there is a story which says, if something that he wanted for the squadron, he asked group for it, and they said, no, he can't do it. So he asked command, and they gave him the same answer. So he said, right, I'll ring Air Ministry, which he did. And they said, sorry, we can't do it. So he said, right, I'll sit in my office until you change your mind. That was typical Gibson, and it worked. They did change their minds, and he got what he wanted. But then, we came to the raid itself. I think this is where his true leadership came to the fore. He made the first attack on the Munich Dam to assess the damages as well as to drop his bomb. And then, having made that assessment, as he called each aircraft in turn, he flew alongside them, attacking as they went in to attack the target. Which says to me, you're doing this, I'm doing this, we're doing this together. And that to me is the essence of good leadership. And I would have to say, yes, he was a good leader. We had no idea, or we were given no idea, what the target would be. What we were given was that everything that we did in our training was had to be kept absolutely secure. We could not talk to anybody about what we were doing or how we were doing it. We had already been surprised by, first of all, the replacement aircraft which we were going to use, because they had lost their mid-upper turret and they seemed to have had their bomb bay sealed. But they'd got these two prongs hanging down towards the nose, one on the port, one on the starboard side of the fuselage, and one of them had a grooved wheel attached to the end of it. We'd also seen the bomb when it arrived, and it just looked like a glorified dustbin, but it became obvious that those legs were going to support that bomb, and that was how it was going to be carried on the aircraft. The night before the actual raid was probably the first time we had any idea of what sort of target we might be attacking. Sir Barnes Wallace showed us the film of his development of the bouncing bomb, from its early destructive arrivals, disappointments, and right through the developments until it was finally produced. And that, of course, set up conjecture as to what the targets might be. And the popular expectation was that the target was going to be German battleships, notably the Tirpitz, since this bomb would blow them up and prevent aircraft from getting too close to their defences before they delivered the bomb. But come the following day, Sunday, tannoy message, all 617 squadron into the operations room, and then we found out what the target was. How wrong can you be? There was a model of the Mohn and a model of the Sorpe. The model of the Ada hadn't been completed at that stage, so obviously it wasn't there. There was a large map on the wall showing the routes in and out, to and from 3 of the German dams. 2 routes out, because it was hoped that tracing aircraft coming in from 2 different parts of the coast would give the Germans an impression of a much bigger raid than was taking on. And then the number of people who were at that briefing, far different from any we'd attended before. The AOC was there, Station Command was there, Wing Commander Gibson was there, Sir Barnes Wallace was there, as were the senior engineering officer, senior signals officer, and the senior armaments officer. And of course, the dear old Metman was there hoping to give us a reasonable forecast as to what we were going to see when we were flying. Perhaps I should have said earlier that throughout our training we had been trained for low-level flying, which meant a maximum of 100 feet. And so all our navigation had to be by map reading, which was coordination between the navigator and the bomb aimer. And it had to be done initially in daylight, then in the simulated twilight, and then ultimately in night, but in moonlight. Obviously, it had to be in moonlight because you can't map read in the dark. But that was the training we had to come through. And we were going to use that type of flying for this particular attack. And the briefing which Gibson delivered was that he would take off with 2 other aircraft and they would head for the Squadron Dam. The second group was to be the group that was going to the Sorpe Dam, and then that's 5 aircraft. And then the third group would be going, following Gibson in the southern route, and taking over at the Squadron Dam if it hadn't been breached by that time, and once it had been breached, going over to the Ada to attack that. But the 5 that were briefed for the Sorpe, of which we were one crew, had a totally different type of attack altogether. The dam itself was so different. In the first place, it had no towers, and in the second place, it was so placed in the hills, it was virtually impossible to make a head-on attack. And so the method of attack was going to have to be going down one side of the hills, with the aiming to get the port outer engine running along the dam itself, and estimating to drop the bomb as near as possible to the centre of the dam, it being at that stage, of course, on the water side of the dam. We weren't spinning the bomb at all, it was just an inert drop. It wasn't easy to get that system sorted out. We had no practice in that sort of attack anyway, but apart from that, it was practice from the word go, in actual fact. And I learnt, if I wasn't satisfied, I called dummy run. If Joe wasn't satisfied, he called dummy run and left me to call dummy run. And I learnt very quickly how to become the most unpopular member of the crew. After the 6th or 7th dummy run, a voice from the rear turret says, "Won't somebody get that bum out of here?" However, we pressed on, and although nothing was said between us, I'm sure that both Joe and I appreciated the lower we got, the less forward travel that bomb was going to have before it hit the water. And what is more, the lower we got, the easier it would be to estimate the aiming point. So on the 10th run, we were perfectly lined up, but we're down to 30 feet, and I managed to see exactly where I wanted to drop the bomb. When I said, "Bomb gone," a voice from the rear carrier says, "Thank Christ." But there we are. Dave was in fact our crew comedian, but he was quite serious about those comments when he made them. And I can see, from his point of view, in the rear turret, we had seen no fighters at all. We knew when we came out that was partly because we were going out so low, and so we were below German radar, and they weren't able to bait the fighters onto us. But whilst we were attacking this target, every time we went round again, we were round about 1,000 feet. So that if there'd been any fighters anywhere around, they would have had to put up pots up. And I could see from the rear gunner's point of view That was something that he had to be very, very careful about. Of course, the thing that surprised us was nobody in the village seemed to ring the local people and say there's aircraft attacking the dam. They just didn't do it. But we also learned, no, that's another story I want to tell. But I couldn't see because it was nose up as soon as we dropped the bomb to avoid hitting the hills on the far side. But Dave from the rear turret said that he felt that the spout of water that went up to about 1,000 feet. But when you consider 6,500 pounds of explosive being set off at a depth of 25 feet, it's going to send a lot of water up a long way. And Dave said, unfortunately, in the downpour, some of it came into the turret, so I thought I was going to be drowned as well as not drowned by you lot. When we circled down and had a look, we had crumbled the top of the dam for a distance of about 20 yards, and so we set course for home. And on the route, we came across what had been the Moan Dam, and it was just like an inland sea. There was water everywhere, and it was still coming out of the dam. And at that time, that must have been 20 minutes, perhaps half an hour, since the dam had been breached. We had the satisfaction of seeing that success of the raid, and of course we'd heard that the Ada had been breached as well. What we hadn't understood when we got to the Sorpe, we had been late taking off, but when we got there, nobody else was there, and nobody else arrived whilst we were there. And then 5 had been briefed to attack that dam in the first place. And it wasn't until we got home that we discovered why that was. Les Monroe had been so badly shot up going in over the islands. Apart from any other damage to the aircraft, it had completely shattered his communication system, internal and external. And since this was obviously a communications operation, no point in him going on from there. So he came back home. It was a sort of job that I enjoyed. I felt I was responsible, very much responsible, for the ultimate outcome of the flight. And to do that, I had to concentrate and make sure I did to the best of my ability. It never once worried me about being over the target, any target that was able to be defended whilst we were on the bombing run, but I was concentrating purely on that job. And that was my job as well, you know. A squadron which I find, or I feel, has maintained to the highest degree the name and the valour of the squadron, and particularly now with their work in Afghanistan.
Whenever you want. 50 doors, bomb doors open, please.
Pretty text selected.
You're over the center. Easing it out. You're back minus 2, yeah. That's as low as you want to go, I think. -1. Alright, let's just hold it there. Big thumbs up from Johnny. Very good. I'll go to 0 boost, please. 0 boost.
Stand right on
corner. Roger that. Low 150 bomb doors closed.
Contact select.
Just too much fun. Okay. Thank you. Get some air, you can get her out of here. Following the valley down, mate. Copy that.